Good morning, and warm welcome to our audience and to our special guests who are here to participate in the most recent installment of the JSOU Future of SOF Forum Series. We have an innovative and unique series of panels for the next 2 days that help us all, as interested parties and stakeholders in the SOF profession, to explore the SOF identity. For a profession as broad, storied, and well-known, but also as misunderstood as special operations, particularly in the joint sense, it follows that identity, the critical building block of organizational culture, should be reviewed and refreshed from time to time in order to reflect on who we are as a SOF enterprise from the perspective of where we have been, what we do, who we are comprised of, and where we are going. In order for us, those who have taken their valuable time to help us expand our collective knowledge and understanding of the SOF profession, as participants and the audience, to explore the identity of the SOF profession, we are going to do so through a series of 4 critical lenses. This forum will feature 2 moderated discussion panels per SOF identity lens for a total of 8 panels. That's 4 lenses times 2 panels each. And then we will conclude with a final moderated discussion about the practical impacts of our identity exploration in an attempt to look toward the future of special operations. The first of the 4 lenses we will investigate collectively is the utility of SOF. In doing so, we will feature a panel that explores what SOF accomplishes strategically in the context of strategic competition, followed by a similarly organized panel that examines the SOF operational environment, all in order to better understand what is truly distinct and peculiar about special operations. In the second lens, we will build on the idea of SOF utility and take a deep dive into SOF ethics. In one panel, I will moderate a discussion pondering the distinct nature of the SOF ethical environment, and in the second panel, we will look at ethical decision-making in highly complex special operations. This panel will signal the end of day 1 of our 2-day SOF Identity Forum. Tomorrow, we begin with the 3rd SOF Identity lens as we investigate SOF's relationship with technology. The first panel will look at technologies that impact SOF operations, and the second panel will seek to understand the nexus between SOF technology and the first SOF truth that humans are more important than hardware. Tomorrow afternoon, we will present 2 panels exploring the 4th identity lens, understanding diversity and inclusion in special operations. The first panel explores diversity and inclusion as a function of mission success, and the second panel explores the organizational culture of SOF and the role that diversity and inclusion play in understanding the SOF identity. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll conclude with a short discussion about special operations and influence operations as a function of what we are doing now in order to look ahead at where we are going. Please remember that this forum follows Chatham House rule. This means you may feel free to use the information derived from these panels, but you should withhold attribution to the speaker or presenter. Also, this entire forum is intended to remain completely unclassified. Please refrain from dialogue that violates classification standards. This forum will be recorded and used for educational purposes. Therefore, the opinions presented by all speakers during the forum are those of the presenters alone, not the U.S. government nor JSOU. You are likely to see competing opinions about certain subjects during this forum, and that is by design. JSOU respects and encourages academic freedom, and this forum is intended to function as a discovery learning process. Members of the audience are encouraged to ask questions and should preference questions in the chat box with #Q. This is so that our curators can more easily identify your questions. Thank you all for your participation and attention to these details. As we explore the SOF identity through these 4 lenses, this understanding of the compound security dilemma provides the necessary strategic backdrop for the threats facing the future of our nation, and therefore the complexities of special operations' various roles in national defense and strategic positioning. To help us understand the compound security dilemma even deeper, I would like to introduce the JSOU President, Dr. Ike Wilson, and our very special keynote guest. General David H. Petraeus is the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency and Chairman of the KKR Global Institute. He previously held command of the Surge in Iraq, of U.S. Central Command, and of coalition forces in Afghanistan. General Petraeus is a graduate of and former professor at West Point who holds a PhD from Princeton. He has been a visiting professor at the City University of New York, the University of Southern California, and at Harvard University. He is currently a visiting fellow at Yale. Gentlemen, thank you for coming, and the floor is all yours.
Dr. Long, Joe, let me just thank you for that great opening and introduction. And General Petraeus, sir, always a pleasure to speak with you. I see by your coffee mug, you remind me of the Rendezvous with Destiny, and this is yet again another one of those. Brings me back to some good old hard times, some of which I think we'll inevitably reflect back on in this conversation that we're looking to have to start this two-day event. Really what I've called foresighting the future and for SOF, for nation, not itself. And we want this to be a conversation, a weighted conversation, unbalanced conversation, certainly me setting the stage to hear from you, sir. I can't think of anyone more right and ripe for helping us open up this conversation, someone who's lived, commanded, and led at every echelon at this nexus between ultimately foresighting and intelligence, the intelligence community, particularly with your roles as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and your multi-echelon leadership within DoD and the military armed services. So, sir, let me just quickly welcome you. And for our audience, for our participants, the way we're going to look to have this conversation is, sir, I've got some questions that you and I will go back and forth with for a bit of time, nothing belabored. Really three categories of conversations. What I'd like to do is start strategically, really grand strategically, cover this change and changing character of global geopolitical competition and what the implications, promise and perils, good, bad, and indifferent for the nation, and particularly through the lens of our special operations forces and community. Then go closer to terra firma, if you will, set of conversation questions that get to what those implications of this environment, some of which the video put a foil on the table for us to fence with, of what this means for special operations use and utility for the next 50 years, frankly, and then get into the identity, the human dimension, again, beginning and ending with that soft truth, number one, the human element, the human domain, and human over hardware. Sir, let me just open up. Let me give you an opportunity to say a couple of opening words, and I'll get right into the question and conversation. After a few minutes, we'll open it up for the full virtual living room for curated Q&A discussions. But first, over to you, sir, just for some openers.
Thanks, Ike. Look, my openers are just to say thanks for the opportunity to be with you all. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for what you did back in the day when you were the mighty chief of plans of the great 101st Airborne Division, Multinational Division North in Mosul and Nainawa Province and the Kurdish Regional Government, not within a couple of months of the invasion of Iraq, and what you've done since then in a variety of different capacities, including at our alma mater, the Social Sciences Department at West Point. And now congratulations on the new position, which I think is clearly an exciting one at a pivotal time for SOF and for our country. So congratulations on all of that.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into it. Let's get into this. And first, big question, and really, the 16-minute video really, again, laid out not the answer, not the script, but a theory of next, and just that, a theory of next, a testable set of belief statements based on an assessment and, frankly, a future forecast of the environment of conduct and how it's changed, perhaps in this cycle of so-called return to great power competition, a transformational strategic inflection point. So our first question, in a broad sense, I'd just like to give you an opportunity to put your own foil, your own forecast on the table. What do you see as, what's your reaction to this character change and changing of geopolitical competition? And what is the utility of SOF in that current and emergent strategic environment?
Well, clearly, again, we're in an era of renewed great power competition. That's the big focus. It should be. It's correct. Certainly, one great power deserves a great deal more focus than the other. China over Russia, but Russia has been assertive. It has been troublesome meddling and so forth in Eastern Europe, Syria, North Africa, Central Asia, and so on. But again, this is really all about China, China, China. But as we think about this world and we think about the role of a superpower in it, the United States, and keep in mind, by the way, just as a set of contextual data points, the United States doesn't just spend more than all of its 29 NATO allies together. It spends more than twice as much as all of them. And by my calculations, if you add up all of the different the drones that really, really matter, which would now for the U.S. be pretty much Reapers, and you ask about the lines, and in other words, the unblinking eyes, the orbits that can be maintained around the world at any given time, somewhere between 60 and 65, should have been higher in my view, as in Secretary Gates' view. But at the end of the day, that could be as much as, say, somewhere from 3 to 5 times as many as all of our allies and partners put together, not just NATO, but also in Asia put together can maintain. And of course, we're willing to shoot from our platform. So that's only one small element, although it's a very important element, as we will discover when we talk about irregular warfare. So there will still be a continuum of conflict. As you pointed out in the slides leading up to this, there are still going to be requirements in a lot of different places around the world. Again, that if you think of the U.S. as the guy in the circus who puts a plate on the stick and gets it spinning and then goes over and does a few more, that China plate will probably not just be bigger than all the others, it'll be bigger than all of them together. That is how central and how key the U.S.-China relationship is, not just to our two countries, but to the entire world. So how that plays out is critical. That is where the emphasis should be. It is where the Department of National Military Strategy and so forth, National Defense Strategy, clearly lays that out. But there are still a lot of other plates that have to be kept spinning. And again, your slides noted that. There are lots of potential flashpoints, conflicts. And we probably, in particular, should have learned 5 lessons from the last 2 decades or so of war. And I'll go through them very, very quickly because they are very pertinent to SOF. Number one is that ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world will be exploited by Islamist extremists. Not a question of if, it's a question of when and how bad will it be. Number two is you actually have to do something about it. We have tried in the past to admire the problem or to watch it until it goes away. It doesn't go away. And Las Vegas rules don't apply in those places. Rather, violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees pour out of them and cause enormous problems. As we saw in the case of Syria, the most significant domestic political challenges our NATO allies in Western Europe faced. Number three is in dealing with this, in part because of this predominance of military capability that I highlighted, especially when it comes to certain enablers, such as the ISR platforms we can put up. And of course, we have far more than just the 60 plus lines of Reapers. We have many, many others that can be put up there, including the Predator-like systems that are still in the Army and indeed in 160th Special Ops Aviation Regiment and so forth. But those are the ones that matter, just as a way of comparing our capability relative to all that of the others. So we have to lead. We also have a unique ability to fuse intelligence and a really impressive ability to advise and assist, train, equip, and enable. And again, it's really an awful lot about enabling. And of course, it's in this realm that SOF have shown such an extraordinary ability, both with our counterterrorism forces and with our special forces and the similar elements beyond our Army and, of course, in the Marines, Air Force, and so on, as we use them, needless to say, in Afghanistan and Iraq. But it should be a coalition, and that coalition should include Muslim countries. Coalitions are hard. Churchill was right when he said that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. Having commanded the largest combat coalition on the ground in Afghanistan, I can tell you that coalition maintenance takes a lot of time. It's worth it. Even if you have to determine what the shortcomings as well as the strengths of every contingent are, they all have caveats, even the UK, and we had to compensate to some degree for those throughout the country of Afghanistan. The fourth lesson that we should have learned is that you can't counter terrorists. You can't counter extremists like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State with just counter-terrorist force operations. In other words, you can't drone strike or Delta Force raid your way out of this problem. I remember General McChrystal in the first half of the surge when he was commanding the JSOC, and he came to me and he said, boss, we've been banging away in Ramadi every single night for 2.5 years, and it has continually gotten worse. And the reason was, of course, because we didn't clear, hold, build, and then transition. So it takes everything. It takes a comprehensive civil military campaign, such as we developed in the 101st Airborne Division in the first year in Mosul, and such as we once again developed during the surge in Iraq with Ambassador Crocker as the greatest diplomatic partner any general ever had. So it's got to be a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign as a construct. You can call it whatever you want, but that's going to be what's needed. But, and this is a massive but underlined, we don't want to do most of the tasks associated with that. And we have finally figured out, because of the enablers that we can bring to bear, we didn't have this constellation of drones, even during the surge in either country. Now we have this, so we can have our host nation partners do the fighting on the front lines with our ISR platforms, our precision airstrike, our intelligence fusion, and so forth. They can do the restoration of basic services. They can do the reestablishment of local grievance mechanisms, governance, markets, schools, health clinics, repair of infrastructure that's damaged, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we want to do. And that is a breakthrough. And of course, SOF of all flavors have had a huge impact in that. And they are now actually implementing that, of course, which is vastly different when you think of the 165,000 American men and women we had on the ground during the surge in Iraq, or the 100,000 in Afghanistan, and that we're now there with just a few thousand in each place, but with a boatload of enablers. And of course, it was less than 6,000 American men and women in uniform, a lot of them SOF, who enabled the Iraqi security forces to defeat the Islamic State as a caliphate. There's still insurgents and terrorists, to be sure, that we have to go after, and in Syria to do that with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are special mission units and SOF and special forces established in the first place. So, and then lesson number 5 is maybe the most important for what we're talking about here, and that is that this particular fight is the fight of a generation or generations, not the fight of a decade or a few years. So if you apply those lessons, you recognize that there is going to be a very substantial continuing need for special operations forces of all types. Again, and I'd also include CA and PSYOPs and aviation, both Army and Air Force, and all the rest of that, in addition to the ones that normally come to mind. And that's going to be in that irregular warfare part of the continuum of the spectrum of conflict. And I think now we should look at that, because there will continue to be all kinds of tasks beyond the central focus of our major forces, which again will be on the Indo-Pacific region rightly. But there's going to have to be activity in a whole variety of other places in the world, whether it is support to civil authorities in the home front, all the way up through partner development, huge task. I mean, first group is going to need big augmentation to take on this priority when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, needless to say. And so again, hopefully you'll see 19th and 20th and other services, special forces and so forth, all engaged in this. And you're going to move up. Again, there's going to be the actual enabling of host nation partners on the ground in the conduct of irregular warfare. That will include our CT with their CT, very likely. Occasional conduct of actual U.S.-only CT operations. Certainly our special forces. And again, and by the way, integrated with the Army's security force assistance brigades in advance, I think is very, very important and very helpful. And again, a natural partner again, for our white SOF in a lot of different areas. CA and PSYOPs all integrated into this. And by the way, as an aside, if we want to talk about reorganization of SOF, and I guess we'll get to that later, the one that I would actually like to see us embark on first would actually be to get CA and PSYOPs back, in a sense, part of USASOC once again, as opposed to underneath the USAR. I was a 3-star when that change was made. I never understood it at the time. At Leavenworth, I was in charge of the IO, that function. That was a new function, the information operations function. We wrestled with it. And again, the idea that you split them off as was done, understanding that they are Army Reserve elements, but the ideal would be, I think, to have them under a USA KPOC that is back underneath a USA SOC and ties them much closer together the way you have 19th and 20th Group under 1st SF Command, which means that there's just an access, there's a degree of ownership, mentorship, assistance. They're part of that team and much more inclined, therefore, to remember them, to use them, to integrate them, and to make them, frankly, indistinguishable from active duty special forces elements. So again, that's going to be very important. You're going to continue to move up the continuum of conflict. Again, there's going to be a lot of deterrence and defense in this, of course, before you get ultimately to the major combat operations. Even there, of course, there'll be a need for SOF, although I think we have to be careful and not have too much angst about the reality that SOF may not be the main effort for once if it comes to major combat operations. The fact is that increasingly, first of all, it is going to be absolutely multi-domain. Certainly in the Indo-Pacific, it's an air and maritime includes subsurface as well as surface, needless to say, and space and cyber, all of that together. Certainly there's some role for SOF in there, especially if they were with some partner forces, especially if they're making some of these partner forces capable of denial, area denial and so forth, and really making them into hedgehogs, et cetera. But I think you have to also recognize there's no task that hasn't yet been discovered that is going to once again make SOF the main effort in the event of a major combat operation. But that's okay. Again, a supporting effort, if it's keeping all these other plates on their sticks spinning while the focus of big DOD and big services and so forth is on that big plate, again, which is larger than the others, I think that's a very, very important task. And it is crucial that commanders of elements recognize sometimes, even though they want to be the main effort, that they may not be. I'll give you one analogy as the final comment in this question. During the fight to Baghdad, the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, you had 3 Army units. You also had a Marine division, of course, and the Brits and some others. But there was one Army Corps. It had the 3rd Infantry Division mechanized, of course, a mix of tanks and Bradleys. You had the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault, and you had an element of the 82nd Airborne Division. Now, every one of those divisions thought that it should be, of course, the main effort. We, of course, in the 101st wanted to air assault. Our next rendezvous with destiny is north to Baghdad, and we trying to convince the Corps we should air assault on Baghdad International Airport, again, and air assault into history. About less than a week into that operation, I realized, you know what? Our best contribution to the overarching effort would be to support the advance of the 3rd Infantry Division mechanized. Let's push our 72 Apaches we had. Let's push them out in front of the 3rd Infantry Division, especially as you approach the Karbala Gap and beyond that, which is where a lot of the our long-range artillery, rockets, missiles, air defense, and so forth were located. The commander of 3ID asked for some 155 millimeter howitzer ammo. They'd run out almost. We didn't just give him the ammo, we gave him the entire unit that we had because it was quicker to get it to him that way. He wanted an infantry battalion. I gave him the battalion I commanded, in fact, to join that. Whatever we I said we should internally change our mission to think of ourselves as a follow and support force. We should clear these cities that 3ID has blown by with their tanks, Najaf, Karbala, Hilla, and some others, which are right on the lines of communication. And without those lines being clear, 3ID runs out of gas and it runs out of bullets. And so that turned out to be exactly what we needed to do to facilitate the success of the main effort. Dave Perkins' brigade eventually doing the Thunder Run through Baghdad, which brings down the regime much more rapidly than we had imagined. I think that, SOF to some degree is in that position where you have to realize that maybe the best contribution we can make in an era of great power competition is to perform a host of different tasks that really, in a sense, are supporting efforts to the main effort, but they're actually being done. I mean, SOF are still going to be fighting. They're going to be engaged in fights with extremists throughout areas of Africa, the greater Middle East, Central and South Asia, the Indo-Pacific, as well, as you know, in several different countries there. And I think that is a hugely important contribution, in addition to the contribution that, again, you know, our daughter-in-law was an active duty SOF member in civil affairs, didn't just serve in Afghanistan, also served in Southeast Asia. And again, made what they thought was a very important contribution to the partner building, development, and information operations effort out there. These kinds of tasks are going to be much more important, I think, than people realize. And oh, by the way, they're actually going to be performing them rather than preparing to perform them, which is what the bulk of our military is going to do, as we did during the Cold War, not wanting to use that analogy because the context is very different. But as during that time when, you know, here you are all deployed on the inter-German border, that's the focus, except that you got SOF engaged in irregular warfare in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Colombia, not to mention a variety of other places. And it's much, much more now, given those 5 lessons that I described that we should have learned from the post 9/11 period.
Wow, sir, that is true. Matt, your point on special operations forces, you know, certainly U.S., but joint and combined context. This point you make about getting back, I would call it back to the future, getting back to the future core identity of support too. You know, being that element that is prepared and agile enough to do what the nation and the nations demand of it in a different way, right? This idea of the irregular approach, different, soft, special operations equaling different, and again, full continuum, maybe at those points where bone rubs against bone, those ligament and tendon points between the musculature that defines this continuum of, you know, what we're calling cooperation, competition, conflict.
Very much so. Sure. No, I think you're going to see it throughout. You may have situations in which actually CJSOTFs have conventional forces under them. Picture an element of an SFAB as an example. Or, you know, we actually, you may recall during Afghanistan, during the major period of that, what the special forces were doing with the Afghan local police program was so important. This is the village security initiative and so forth, was so important that I actually took 2 infantry battalions and split them up across north and south and put them underneath the CJSOTFs that were conducting the operations in those areas, because we needed to double the capacity of our very treasured special forces teams, along with we actually had some Marine and Air Force teams engaged in that as well. So that was hugely important. And again, I think you're going to see that kind of activity. And again, do not at all diminish the partner capacity building that SOF uniquely can do when it comes to some really key countries on the periphery of what's called the first island chain and actually beyond, because it really is all about that kind of activity in addition to what we're doing to build up our capabilities and ensure that Guam is the largest, you know, unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific, and an island of the Marianas, and so forth, so on. All of these places that we knew intimately during World War II are becoming once again very, very prominent.
Yes, sir. Again, this undergirding theme of Back to the Future. We talk in JSOU. We're frankly doing some theorizing about what we're calling special operations at the threshold crossing the 4th age of SOF organization. When you look back at the preceding 3 ages that begin with the days of World War II, Wild Bill, Donovan, and moving forward. And we'll get into this in a second, this collision today between a 4th technological revolution and a 4th age of SOF, and the good, bad.
Let me talk about that for a second, because I think, you know, one of the huge advantages that SOF has, I actually see this from my world in the investment position in the investment world, because even though we don't do venture capital, we do it personally. But I watch venture capitalists because they eventually produce companies that are large enough for us to invest in them. There are venture capital firms that exist to do nothing more than produce products, services, et cetera, that can be provided to SOF initially, because the SOCOM procurement process is so much more agile and adaptable and so forth. And of course, that of our special mission units is even more so, although the demand is obviously of a much smaller quantity given the size of those forces. But that is so unique. Let's keep in mind that many of the real achievements during the height of our fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan were gained by Secretary of Defense going around the system rather than through it. When we purchased the MRAPs, the additional drones, the pressure for additional drone units, all of that soldier kit that really enabled our own conventional forces, general purpose forces, to have almost the same kit as their special forces counterparts, special operations counterparts. All of this was done with a series of different organizations that were essentially workarounds, whether it was JSOU or the Rapid Fielding Initiative or a variety of these others, or by Gates just bludgeoning the system, driving this procurement through. SOF can do that without a SecDef having that override. And that is of enormous value, because we do need to recognize that we are going to come to a point in time where it is no longer going to be operator versus operator, or again, soldier against soldier. It's going to be robot against robot. It's going to be drones, swarms of drones out ahead of the man, not just the wingman, but out ahead of the manned aircraft. And it's going to be all about the algorithms. And by the way, we are going to have to come to grips with a reality that you are not going to have a person in the loop at the final moment determining whether to pull the trigger or not. The person in the loop is going to make the decision to go to weapons free when the conditions and all the conditions are ticked off. Because if you insert a person in the loop at that final moment, your robot's dead. Your unmanned system is dead. And so again, SOF have long been experimenting with this. They've been on the bleeding edge of all of these developments, and I expect that to continue. And that itself will be a huge contribution to the future. By the way, the same in social media. Again, when you look at our PsyOps elements, and again, one reason that I want to see them come back, I'm not saying that they aren't integrated, they aren't employed, but it's very, very different from what we had when you had USACAPOC under USASOC. And that closeness, that relationship, that just blending, again, you almost couldn't tell the difference between the active and the reserve, the same way you have, again, as I mentioned, with the two reserve component SF groups. That's what you want to achieve. And this is going to be crucial stuff. PsyOps will be hugely important. CA, when it comes to partner development and actually partner activities, will be very, very important. So I think you look across what SOF can deliver, even into the advance of technology, much more rapidly than the much larger services are probably able to accomplish, unless there are continued workarounds of some type or other. And of course, to be fair, there's a lot of initiatives there. The Army Futures Command and our old service is an example of that. There are various initiatives underway, but it's tough because the amounts are so much bigger, and you can't experiment. You can't fail fast if you're going to do something that's the size of, again, an entire service. So I think SOF will be on the absolute cutting edge in this particular area as well.
So this brings us right to questions of force structure and design. And I want to bring now the big elephant in the room. This elephant walks into the room cyclically, never so often. We're at a point where it's really, trumpeting itself and
it ought to walk back out.
And this issue is, the good, bad, and ugly of SOF becoming its own independent service. What you speak to here,
Sure.
The intimacy, in order to have SOF special operations producing different at speed of need in the context of the service. I think you paint my assessment on the table. what you paint is a strong argument for why we maybe should stick with the service like, but not in the full independent service. I just would like you to maybe.
That's correct. Well, I mean, you've divined my sense of this, frankly. Look, I mean, first of all, life is all about big ideas. I mean, strategic leadership, there's 4 tasks. You got to get the big ideas right. That's not easy, by the way. You have to communicate them throughout the breadth and depth of the organization. You have to oversee their implementation, and then you have to formally sit down, determine how to refine them, change them, add to them, and do it again and again and again. This works whether it's Netflix, which has reinvented itself at least 4 times under Reed Hastings, one of the great strategic leaders of the world, or frankly, if it's a surge in Iraq, where you adopt ideas that are literally 180 degrees different from what we were doing before. We've been consolidating on big bases, handing off tasks to the Iraqi security forces and trying to go home. Instead, we recognize the Iraqi security forces could not provide that critical component of security. We recognize you can only secure the people by living with them. So we're back into all these joint security stations, 77 additional bases just in the Baghdad area alone. That's a massive idea. Big idea about change is that change can be enormously disruptive. And this would be, I think, hugely disruptive. And so therefore you have to be absolutely certain that the benefits of this change are going to outweigh, again, all the disruption and the challenges that are created by it. First of all, I really don't see anything that is broken. I mean, I see SOF getting, even when the rest of the services were going down, SOF was going up. It's continued to get additional modest end strength increases, probably about what it can actually man. Again, people, not equipment and all the rest of that. The quality that's necessary for that. By the way, the linkage to the service, I think, enables SOF to recruit much more effectively than would be the case if they're no longer, in a sense, a service chief doesn't care. Now they're competition. Let's face it, they really work for SOCOM. SOCOM is a bit like a service, and it's also a force provider, combatant command, of course, to JSOC and to the geographic combatant commanders. Again, I think that has worked exceedingly well. I'm also very, very leery of yet another whole institution with another service, a secretary, a secretariat, a chief, this, that, all these other, what does that really do? I mean, this is almost like the EU, where the solution to every problem is a new headquarters. And I always, every time they ask me, so what do you think about the European Security Defense Initiative? And I say, well, tell me how many additional, again, infantry battalions, cyber battalions, SOF battalions you're going to produce together with this, not just how many more multinational headquarters you're going to create, which are just, reshuffling the forces that are still under them and may actually drain resources from them. So I just don't see the logic here. Certainly not sufficient to outweigh what would be, I think, some real costs, some setbacks, and at the very least, enormous disruption. And frankly, I saw the system working very, very well in my final years when, for example, Michelle Flournoy was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and you had, of course, the Assistant Secretary for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict doing, I thought, a superb job. And I thought a very good interface with Tampa, oversight of the forces in the field. Again, I thought it worked exceedingly well. There were some terrific people in that position during that time. And so, again, I just don't see some really important argument for why we should change what is actually working quite well now. The other thing is, of course, SOF gets a huge benefit. It gets a $20 million, $25 million Chinook from the Army, let's say. Army buys it, and then it adds another $20 million in avionics and radar and the probe and all the other assets that go on to make it SOF specific. Again, why change that process? Now you're going to talk about a budget for SOF that would be enormous. It's no longer hidden inside the services. And again, I just think it tends to change that relationship that is really quite healthy. Having been the aide for a chief of staff of the Army and watching his pride in SOF and going with him to the compound at Fort Bragg and the USASOC after the Panama invasion and after the Gulf and all the rest of this stuff, to see that pride of service, even as, of course, a clear recognition. They were never operating under Army commanders in these operations. They were under some form of CJSOF or SOCCENT or whatever it was. So again, I think the system is actually working quite well. I was a little bit mystified by the changes made in the final weeks of the previous administration, which just didn't seem to make sense to me. And I would go forward with where we are and try to make this as absolutely perfect as you can. And again, recognizing, again, the focus of the future is the main focus, the main effort is the great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. SOF is inevitably going to play a supporting role. That's okay. It'll be a hugely significant one, and it'll be throughout the spectrum of conflict, even in that theater. There are still ongoing combat operations, obviously, in the southern Philippines and potentially some other locations as well. And I think make this work, get the right people into the positions, because of course people often can be policy. But again, make that work rather than re-engineering something and causing the enormous disruption that would produce.
Thanks for that, sir. I want to maybe a couple more questions before we open up to the virtual living room here. By, with, and through. You emphasize in your early answer to the first question, the imperatives of allies and partners. You know, the by, with, and through, the train, advise, assist, and accompany roles. It seems to me another Back to the Future story. 21st century enablement with emergent technology of some very old, long-standing tradecraft. I think we sometimes find ourselves subconsciously envying the utility of the totalitarian states of a rising China and a revanchist Russia and their disruptors playbook, disinformation, little green men. Sometimes to the point where we forget perhaps who we are, interests, values, and interests being really the same, and a more positive aims-based, much longer standing disruptors of the disruptors playbook, if you will. And that really speaking to support to national resistance and resilience operations, again, the by, with, and through. So the question, you know, what are tangible steps in your view, big ideas perhaps we can take to reinvigorate and modernize our alliances as stated in this new interim national security strategic guidance in particular? Well,
first of all, it is absolutely the right approach, and it is a unique force multiplier. In fact, there's an op-ed this morning, I think in the Washington Post by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense that talks about this as a force multiplier, our allies and partners around the world, and how this administration wants to, again, reinvigorate, I think is the term that they used, and so forth. And I think that is absolutely right. Again, this is a strength that we uniquely have. Our potential great power competitors, potential adversaries, do not have alliances and partners and allies of the number that we have, or at all in some cases. They may have some client states, but that's not quite the same. And certainly this is a systemic rivalry. Let's make no mistake about it. History is back. Remember Francis Fukuyama's piece that asserted that the end of history was near. This is in 1989. What he was writing about history is that not just the dialectic, but the competition between two competing systems. One was the US-led Western system of democratically elected governments and free market economics of various flavors. The other was the Soviet-led system with a Soviet Communist Party and a command economy. And he rightly predicted that this would collapse of its own weight, that markets allocate resources much better than do, again, bureaucrats of the Communist Party. He turned out to be right. He got a book deal. National Interest had 10,000 subscribers. I was one at the time. I was in an academic phase, in fact. And lo and behold, again, for the next 20 years or so, the U.S. stood astride the world, and that system was clearly viewed as the zenith of achievement when it comes to governance and to economics. It's back. And by the way, this other system is doing exceedingly well over the last 41, 42 years, has achieved growth that no major country has ever achieved in the past. And oh, by the way, there are, as you said, there are some advantages to a system in which if the leader says we're all going to wear masks or all going to lock down or all going to show a cell phone with a barcode on it every time we go into a building, which is the current way of controlling people because of the pandemic. A friend of mine is over there right now, has been there for several months. And that's, there's no question about you breaking the 14-day quarantine when you arrive. You're going to do that. So there's an advantage to that. I certainly treasure our system and the freedoms that we have, fought to protect, which are not present to the same degree by any means. In fact, in some cases, completely the opposite. But at the end of the day, our system has been, bruised a bit throughout the world. Look at the challenges, again, of the democracies in Europe. There are a couple of them that really have become elected autocracies or trying to head in that direction. They've all been challenged by, again, the enormous influx of migrants and so forth, and refugees from Syria, from North Africa, from Central Asia. And of course, the economies have not performed in the way that many of the citizens of these countries would like to see. And again, I think we have to look at our own system and acknowledge that there is a degree of hyperpartisanship that is certainly not helpful. So there are challenges for our system, and we've got to, take the steps to solidify our systems and our economies, come out of this pandemic roaring. I think we will. I think we're going to see the highest economic growth in this year that we have seen in over 50 years, could be as over 8%. Some are even saying as much as 10%. So all of that is ongoing. That's the context in which we operate. And as you note, there are some advantages to an authoritarian system in certain tasks. There are some disadvantages as well. And what we have to show is that our system's advantages, for all of the noise and demonstrations and all the rest of this, just produces some intangible qualities that make it better, and certainly one in which we want to live. When you talk about the by, with, and through, by the way, I've been waiting for years to note that, first of all, it's ungrammatical. You don't operate by. They're operating by. The with and through is okay. I think a far better terminology is actually, and because it's also more descriptive, is to say train and equip, advise and assist, and enable. Those are all very, very clear. They're all grammatical, the right, whatever verbiage of verbs. And very clearly, we are going to continue to refine how we do that. I think we have done a masterful job, again, in learning how to take advantage of this constellation of drones, the intelligence fusion capability, the precision air assets, and indeed the ability to train, equip, advise, assist, and enable to help us to achieve our objectives, noting that some of them are going to take decades, and all you're trying to do is manage. It's okay to manage a problem sometimes. And I hope that out of the current debate on Afghanistan will come a recognition that we went there for a reason. That's where 9/11 attacks were planned, when Al-Qaeda had a sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan. Our forces eliminated that. We have stayed to ensure that that is not reestablished, something Al-Qaeda has repeatedly tried to do, and the Islamic State now is trying to do as well. And that has also been a very useful platform for the regional counterterrorism campaign. Well known, obviously, that the operation by SEAL Team 6 to bring Osama bin Laden to justice. In fact, during my final months as the commander there, though that night Bill McRaven worked for the CIA director rather than for me because of the Title 50 authorities. But that was launched from eastern Afghanistan, as have been other operations, again, under that heading of the regional counterterrorism campaign. And, if it takes 5,000 U.S. troops with a lot of enablers to help our Afghan security force partners continue to control as much of the country as is possible, because again, as I mentioned, ungoverned spaces will be exploited by extremists is lesson number one, then we should be okay with that. Again, there have been less deaths in combat in recent years than in training exercises. and just routine peacetime operations. Again, I think our country can easily keep all those plates spinning, and it'll be done largely by different elements of special operations forces. And that is a huge contribution, again, just to keep managing these, because as we have learned, if you pull out, you lose your influence, you lose your positions on the ground. And if ISIS then stands up and reconstitutes itself because the country's prime minister pursues highly sectarian activities that undo what we did in the surge to bring the fabric of society together again, if that happens, it's really hard to get back in, to reestablish those bases, get back the partnerships, get the enablers over top, and then gradually eliminate a caliphate that was established on the ground, and very, very costly. So again, I'm hopeful that those who are in government now, many of whom were in government then, will recall those episodes and take from that appropriate lessons, noting that each circumstance is different and has a unique context.
Sir, I promised myself before we went directly into open Q&A that I'd exploit this moment. You know, you're living at the nexus, again, this current nexus you live in between, you know, bringing the battlefield and the boardroom. Your roles in the intelligence community, the nexus between intelligence, actionable intelligence, and special operations, integration of special operations with general purpose forces, the old lingo. And I want to take advantage of you and the big idea generation and let you be the futurist here for a second, kind of a back to the futurist. I've found myself, and JSOU's found itself, very fascinated with the old first age. I'll showcase No Royalties here.
Yes, Virginia Hall.
His book, The Virginia Hall Story. I just love your thoughts, maybe quick thoughts on Back to the Future vision of an OSS, an Office of Strategic Services 21 type construction, and that relationship between intel and special ops.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recall that one of the positive outcomes of the 9/11 attacks is that you have seen a vastly improved partnership in several different areas. Number one is between the intelligence community, really the CIA at that time in particular, and special operations forces. I'm not saying it didn't exist. In fact, I was deployed in Bosnia at the time of 9/11, and I had in addition to being the one-star Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations for the NATO Stabilization Force, I was the Deputy Commander of Joint Task Force Justice Assured Forward, which was a forward element for JSOC to do the war criminal hunt. Then we turned it into a counterterrorism task force. And there was a good interface between CIA and the special operations, where we had special mission units actually. But that has gotten much, much, much better. And so CIA with really the rest of government, but especially the US military writ large, and frankly, between Black SOF and White SOF, that was not a trivial barrier back prior to 9/11. And then between all SOF and our general purpose forces. I mean, all of this has really integrated much better. There are a variety of ways to continue that. I know that the SOCOM community is very, very focused on a critical position at CIA. It's called the Associate Director for Deputy Director for Military Affairs. It's usually a first-time 3-star job. Sometimes it has been 2-star, but that's a key position. I think Tony Thomas did it. I think I selected him when I was the director, and he came in shortly after. That is crucial. And so is, by the way, the secondment. And that, waxes and wanes. There are SecDefs that get upset about the fact that, people we're paying for are working for the agency. I think that's a hugely positive experience. The agency never, ever has enough folks in its special activities center now, the ground branch and so forth. So having that augmentation is a fantastic experience for those who are able to do that. And it is a great experience, again, for really for the agency to have them in its midst as well. And those relationships endure when you're out in countries and you're out in preparation of the environment, all these other tasks. It's hugely valuable. It can even, some of those actually go through the training of the farm and so forth. So very, very valuable, I think, and something to be continued. But we must ensure, as we settle back into what will be less of a, again, big irregular wars, where this is absolutely necessary, we have to make sure that barriers don't, stovepipes aren't reestablished, and all the rest of that. And we have to, when it comes to SOF, again, just one last comment on the big ideas idea. Big ideas don't hit you on the head fully formed if you sit under the right tree like Newton's apple. You get hit on the head by a seed of an idea or a kernel of an idea, and then you have to shape it like a clay object into a fully formed big idea. And that is normally facilitated best by a process that is open, that is transparent, that is inclusive. Everybody's inside the tent offering thoughts. When we did this to determine what are the enduring missions and the emerging missions for the CIA, we had something like 800 to 1,000 submissions in the first weekend that we created a SharePoint website for that subject. That's what you want to get. And inevitably, however smart people may think they are or may actually be, no one of us is smarter than all of us together. And by the way, it also facilitates a very useful team building element as well, and gives people a sense that their views are at least valued, at least heard, even if not operated on in some cases. So that clearly is a process that I know General Clark is engaged in at this point in time. You all are helping him a great deal. I know at JSOU and a variety of the other sort of institutional elements of Special Operations Command world. But that's the way to think about this. And again, not to be frustrated if, again, the big idea doesn't emerge right away. I mean, it took us 3 or more years in Iraq to really arrive at the quote, the wisdom, I guess, or whatever, the lessons that were distilled in a counterinsurgency field manual that then, and only then, provided the intellectual foundation on which we were able to build the campaigns in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
That's outstanding. Thanks, sir. Question from the virtual audience, the living room here. Sir, where do you see SOF in cyberspace in the future?
That's a great question, because I think one of the debates on big ideas is going to be how much capability SOF seeks to establish organic to special operations forces, and how much it relies on cyber command elements, which of course include NSA. I think there inevitably will have to be a core of cyber expertise, but I don't think that it is either possible or wise, perhaps, to use the kind of resources that would be needed to develop a totally organic capability in Special Operations Command elements. And rather, the idea should be to have staff components, elements that enable NSA and cyber command teams, the National Mission Force and so forth for cyber, to plug into these teams. And really what special operations units need to be able to do is to understand what can be provided, what the sources and methods of that are without getting specifics on each bit of finished intelligence, and again, how to task them. What is most critical, I think, is actually, again, understanding what the art of the possible is, so that we avoid that kind of situation that I occasionally used to have when I was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I had what was called a global read-on during that time, and then subsequently at very high levels. And so you actually find out all these little science projects the folks in J39 at the Joint Staff were overseeing. And I used to ask the guys in J39, I said, now, let me get this right. There's only a couple dozen people in the whole military that know about this. How does a commander out in the field even understand to request this if he or she doesn't know about it? So again, this is where I think what SOF needs is that kind of very good cyber expertise and knowledge, but without trying to gather all of that, not gain it itself, but rather rely on the experts at NSA and Cyber Command.
Time for one more, sir, and I want to give you the last word. Synthetic training environments are increasingly being used across services. How do you see SOF's human domain capabilities being represented in these synthetic training environments?
Well, I think it's very, very difficult to do that, frankly. Synthetic environments are phenomenal for certain capabilities. I mean, especially the more a cockpit or even night vision or goggles, period, not just night vision, the more they resemble a synthetic environment, needless to say, the more a synthetic environment is great for training. The human component of that, though, I think we should be very careful to never overlook. It's a bit like in the intelligence world where people will come to you and say, you know, I'm going to crowdsource, or I have these algorithms, or I have this. And if you I actually had this from a very, very senior person in DARPA one time who came out to Afghanistan and said, you know, we have the magic equation here. And if you just sort of follow this equation, you can win this war. It was not. That's not too much of an overstatement of the way it was put. And happily, in the process of preparing for the social sciences department, I'd learned a little bit about equations and research methodology and algorithms and so forth. And I said at the end of the day, you know, the problem with this is that it all seems to be pretty sensible, except what is in President Karzai's mind. You tell me what that is, and keep in mind that it actually changes from time to time, and that events have an effect on that. And so again, this is the same, actually, that, you know, the agency is going through this kind of how much should we rely on digital activity? And clearly the answer is a lot, and also on open source intelligence. Of course, it runs the Open Source Center, as is well known for the DNI, the Office of the DNI. But at the end of the day, that human intelligence, that human input, that human, you know, I don't want to crowdsource something. I want to know what Henry Kissinger has to say. I want to know what, or the individual him or herself has to say, if you can engage that person. By the way, our family dog has very strong views on this, as you can hear.
I can tell.
But I think that's how you need to look at all of this. Certainly take advantage of this. By the way, keep in mind that what is going to be doing a lot of the fighting in the future is going to be algorithms. And the person in the loop is going to be in the development of the algorithms, the development of the checklist that must be met before that weapons free is given to that sensor on the floor of the ocean somewhere between a mainland and an island, and it senses something coming, and it is tied to kinetic capabilities as well. And you say, give it, okay, weapons free, and it identifies what they are, sorts out who gets what, and bam. So that is going to be more and more and more important. But at the end of the day, you're never going to get away from the critical importance of really high quality people. And, oh, by the way, in the intelligence world, really high quality human intelligence as well.
Sir, I can't think about your epilogue ending on soft truth number one, human and hardware, but the human over at hardware. I couldn't think of a better prologue for the rest of our conversations going forward for the rest of the two days. I want to give you
a privilege.
But thank you again, sir.
No,
we have another rendezvous.
It's a privilege, Ike. And let me just say thanks to all those out there that were part of the campaigns that I was privileged to lead over the years, and 4 years in Iraq and a year in Afghanistan and another almost couple at CENTCOM, where I got to see, one of the great privileges was to see all of the different elements of our special operations forces engaged at about as high an op tempo as they could possibly bear, and performing absolutely magnificently. It was truly one of the great privileges of my life, and I remain grateful to them and to all of those who were on this particular session, and to you for the invitation. Thanks.
Shukran, sir. Thank you.
Afwan Habibi.
And Dr. Long, our incomparable host, over to you, sir.
Thank you both, sir. General Petraeus, thank you for a fascinating scene-setting conversation as the ideal starting point and framework for us to begin our exploration of SOF identity. The compound security dilemma frame will no doubt help us all envision SOF future and guide our discussions over the next 2 days of our forum. We will now take a short break before we start the first of today's 4 panels.